A woman twice his age stepped off the stage. Young rancher called her his miracle. The wheel broke on a Thursday. I know it was a Thursday because I'd just come in from mending the south fence line. 3 days of work, sunup to near dark. My hands so cracked by the wire and the cold that I couldn't straighten my fingers all the way. And I was figuring to ride into Creston the next morning for wire staples and flour, and maybe a pound of coffee if what was left in the tin looked as sad as I thought it did. The wheel on the buckboard, right rear, split clean through the hub, which meant it wasn't an accident so much as a message. That wagon had been my father's and his before that. I'd been patching it for 2 years with rope and prayer, and whatever scrap iron I could scavenge off the old dinner place. But there's a point past which a thing stops being fixable, and the right rear wheel of that buckboard had arrived at that point, and it had done it at the worst possible time because the flour situation was what it was. And without the buckboard, I wasn't hauling anything heavier than a saddlebag, which meant I'd be making 2 trips into town on horseback, which meant 2 days instead of 1, which meant 2 days off the fence line, which meant the cattle I just pushed back through to the south pasture were going to have that gap back inside of a week. I stood there looking at the wheel for a long time. The light was going. November, and it got dark early and got cold right behind the dark like it was chasing it. I could see my breath. I wasn't the kind of man who talked to himself out loud. My father had been, and it had unnerved me as a boy. But I thought them hard sometimes, like arguing with somebody who wasn't there. And what I thought, looking at that wheel, was, I am 26 years old and I don't know if this is going to work. That thought had been circling me for about 2 years. Since I'd signed the paper on the Aldrin land, paid what I had and borrowed the rest, and set about trying to make a cattle ranch out of 300 acres of Wyoming hardpan that the previous owner had walked away from. Walked away from laughing, some said. You'd hear it in town. That Prout boy. Buying that ground. Did you hear? Aldrin couldn't make it work, and Aldrin had 40 years on that boy and 2 good sons to help him. What makes a 24-year-old kid think he can do what a man like Aldrin couldn't? Nothing was the honest answer. Nothing made me think I could. I just hadn't had anywhere else to go. My mother had died the spring before, my father the winter before that. I had a younger sister in Cheyenne, married to a man who sold dry goods and doing fine, and she'd writ to say I could come. There was room. Warren wouldn't mind. But I'd have minded. I don't know how to explain that except that some men need to be doing something with their hands, and some need to own the thing their hands are working on, and I was that kind of man. Even then, at 24, I knew it. There wasn't a word for it that wouldn't sound like pride, and maybe it was pride, but it was also just how I was made. So I bought the Aldrin land. I bought the broken fences and the sour well and the barn that listed to the east like it was thinking about lying down, and the house that had 2 windows with no glass in them, just boards nailed over the frames. I bought all of that with what my father had left me, and a loan from a man in Laramie who charged 5% and didn't blink when he said it. 2 years in, the fences were mostly sound. The well was sweet now. I'd dug it deeper by 8 feet the first summer, which about killed me, but the water that came up was clean and cold. The barn still listed, but I'd sistered the east wall studs, and she wasn't getting any worse. The windows had glass in them. I had 43 head of cattle, which wasn't enough to turn a profit, but was enough to see the shape of a profit, the way you can see the shape of a thing in a dark room before the lamp comes up. But I was alone. And the work was a lot. It was every day and it never stopped, and there were no Sundays and no evenings to speak of, just the dark when it came and the lamp. And sometimes I'd sit at the table in that kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold, and I wouldn't be able to remember the last time I'd talked to another person for longer than it took to buy something. My nearest neighbor was a man named Cletus Osgood, who was 63 and cross as a stepton cat, and had no use for me. I'd gone over once, that first fall, to introduce myself, and to see if he needed anything, the way you're supposed to do with a new neighbor. He'd looked at me from his porch like I was something the horse had dragged up. Said he'd managed without any help from a Prout for going on 40 years, and figured he'd manage a while longer. I'd thanked him and ridden home and hadn't gone back. That was the situation when the stage came through Creston the first week of December 1883, and Nora Alcott stepped off it. I didn't see her step off. I wasn't there. I heard about it the way you hear about everything in a town the size of Creston, which is to say, you hear it whether you're looking to or not. I was at the hardware getting my staples and my flour, and standing at the counter waiting for Peel to add up the total when Ed Marker came in with the news the way Ed Marker came in with all news, which was at about twice the necessary volume. Said a woman had come in on the stage from Denver. Said she was looking at the Halton property. Said she was, and this is what I remember him saying because of how he said it, she was a handsome woman, middle-aged, come out here alone. I didn't think much about it. Plenty of people came through Creston looking at property, not many of them stayed, and I had my own concerns. I paid for my staples and my flour, and I went home. I thought about her twice in the next week. Not in any particular way, just the way your mind turns a thing over when there's not much else to occupy it. A woman alone, coming out to look at land. It had a shape to it that was interesting. The Halton place was a decent piece of ground, better than mine in some ways, with a creek that ran through the east quarter. It had been sitting empty since old Bill Halton died in '81, and his son in Omaha couldn't be troubled to do anything with it except pay the taxes, which he kept doing out of what I'd always assumed was guilt. She must have money, I thought, or credit. Either way, none of my business. Then on a Saturday, I know it was a Saturday because that was the day I allowed myself to ride into Creston and eat a hot meal at Me's, which was the one luxury I gave myself every week without argument. I saw her. She was coming out of the bank. Halton's son had come down from Omaha after all, and apparently she'd been in there closing the sale on the Halton property, because she had a folded paper in her hand, and she was putting it into her coat pocket with the careful way a person handles something important. And when she looked up and saw me looking at her, she didn't look away. She was, I want to say it right, because right is important here. She wasn't a girl. She was somewhere around 45, maybe a little older, with gray coming in at her temples and the kind of face that had lines in it from years of weather and expression. Brown eyes. She was taller than most women I knew, stood straight, and she had on a dark coat that was plain but well-made, the kind of coat that said a person didn't feel the need to show off. I took my hat off. I don't know why. I wasn't a man who stood in the street taking my hat off to strangers, but I did it. She nodded at me. Then she walked past toward Me's, which was where I was going, and I put my hat back on and followed at the respectful distance a man maintains when he's 26 and doesn't want to look like he's following a woman. We ended up at adjacent tables. Me's wasn't big. There were 4 tables and the counter, and on a Saturday 3 of those tables were usually taken. She ordered coffee and the roast, which was what I ordered too, and for about 10 minutes we ate without speaking. I wasn't going to say anything. I was aware of her the way you're aware of something new in a room, but I wasn't going to presume on that. Then she said, without looking up from her plate, "You're the Prout boy, the one who bought the Aldrin ground." I said I was, asked how she knew. She said, "Ed Marker told me everything about every person in this county within about 20 minutes of my arriving. He seemed to think it was a service." I said that sounded about right. She looked at me then. Really looked, the kind of look that takes stock, not rude but not apologetic either. She said, "He said you were foolish to buy that ground." I said, "He's not the only one." She said, "Is he right?" I thought about it, said, "Ask me in about 3 years." She almost smiled. Didn't quite get there, but it was close enough to see the shape of it. She said her name was Nora Alcott, said she'd come from Denver, said she'd bought the Halton place and she intended to run sheep on it, which she knew would not be the most popular piece of news in a cattle county. I said I reckoned she knew her own business better than I knew it. She said, "Most people around here seem to disagree with that." I said, "Most people around here thought Aldrin ground couldn't be made to work either." This time the almost smile made it all the way, small but real. I finished my coffee and paid and said it had been good to meet her. She said likewise, that was all. I rode home thinking about her more than seemed reasonable. Now I want to be honest about this next part because it would be easy to tell it wrong. It would be easy to make it simple, make it feel like I saw her and knew something, like there was a moment of clarity, the way stories sometimes have. That's not how it was. What it was, honestly, was confused. She was a good bit older than me, I knew that. I wasn't stupid or blind. She was a woman who'd bought property on her own with her own money, and she didn't need anything from me or from anybody else, which was obvious from about the first 30 seconds of talking to her. And I was a 26-year-old who was barely keeping his head above water on a piece of ground everyone thought was a mistake, and the last thing I needed was something else to think about at night. But she was in my head. That's what I'm saying. She was there. December went. I worked the fence line. I checked on the cattle, moved them twice when the weather pushed them, spent 3 days on the barn roof patching a section that had started to let in water. I rode into Creston twice. Both times I hoped to run into her. I didn't. January came, cold that year. Bad cold, not the kind that just makes your face hurt, but the kind that gets inside things, inside the barn, inside the house, inside your joints if you're out in it too long. I lost 2 head of cattle to a drift up by the north fence that I hadn't known was there until I went looking for them. Found them in the morning, stiff. 26 years old, and I sat in the snow next to those 2 dead animals and felt something close to despair, which was a feeling I didn't let myself have very often, but which had a way of arriving uninvited. Then in February, there was a fire. Not mine, Nora Elcott's. Her barn, Wednesday night, middle of February, temperature around 10 degrees, whined out of the northwest. I saw the glow from my place. Her place was maybe 3 miles west and a little north, and I didn't think. I just saddled up and rode toward it. By the time I got there, the barn was gone. Entirely gone, just a box of orange and red with smoke coming off it in the cold, the heat so strange against the freezing air that the whole thing looked wrong, like something that couldn't be happening. She was out front with a bucket, which was, I don't know what that was. She must have known it was pointless, but she had a bucket. I got down off the horse and went to her. She turned when she heard me, and in the firelight she was calm. That's the thing I remember, not shaken. Angry maybe underneath it, but what was on her face was calm, and behind that, working, calculating. She said, I got the sheep out, all of them. They're in the pasture on the east side. I said I was glad, said, anything in the barn besides the sheep. She said her horse, said it was out too, said she'd been lucky she'd been awake. We watched the barn burn down. There wasn't anything else to do. We stood there in the cold and the light, and at some point she stopped holding the bucket and just held it at her side, and I stood next to her and didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say that wouldn't have been hollow. After a long while she said, I'll need to build. I said yes. She said, in the spring, I can't do it in this. I said no. She looked at me sideways, said, you don't need to stand here. I said I knew that. She didn't say anything else for a while. Then she said, you came pretty quick. I said I'd seen the light, said it wasn't far. She looked back at the fire, said, I haven't had many people come quick before. I didn't know what to make of that, didn't try, just stood there. By about 2 in the morning it had died down enough that there was no more danger to the house or the pasture fence, and she said she was going inside, and I said I'd be back in the morning to look at what was left. She looked at me like she was going to say something. I thought she was going to say no, that she didn't need that she had it handled. But she didn't. She just said, all right. I rode home in the dark and the cold, and I thought about that. All right, the way she said it. Not grateful exactly. She wasn't a woman who performed gratitude, I could already tell that, but something. Like a door that had been latched opening an inch. I came back in the morning. The ruin was black and still smoking faintly, and I walked it with her, and we looked at what the fire had left, which was the stone foundation and some twisted iron hardware and not much else. She was already figuring. I could see it. Talking about where to source the lumber, what size, how the new structure should be oriented to catch less wind. She hadn't asked for my opinion. I offered it anyway. Said I'd built the small addition on my own barn in the fall, and I knew what ground in this county did to a foundation if you didn't go deep enough. She listened without looking at me, which I came to understand was actually her way of listening hard. She went still, and her eyes went somewhere else, and she listened. Then she said what she thought about the foundation depth, which was different from what I'd said, and she was right, and I told her so. We stood in the cold ruins of her barn and talked about construction for about an hour. I came back the next day, and the day after. Not every day I had my own work, but often enough that it stopped feeling like charity and started feeling like something else. She never asked why I kept coming. I never explained. After a while, it would have been strange to explain. You don't explain a habit to someone once the habit is established, you just do it. March. She had a way of making coffee that was strong enough to stand a spoon in. She had books, more than I'd expected, a whole shelf of them, and she'd read most of them twice by the look of the spines. She had an opinion about everything, and she stated it plainly, without apology, and she was wrong sometimes and right sometimes, and when she was wrong she didn't make a production of admitting it, She just adjusted. I'd never known a woman who thought out loud the way she did. My mother had been quiet. The girls I'd known in town before I'd come out here had been, I don't know, either trying to be agreeable or trying to be impressive. Nora Alcott was neither. She was just herself in the room, working through a problem, and if you were useful, she'd let you be useful, and if you weren't, she'd tell you. In March, she said to me one morning without preamble, "People are talking." I said I supposed they were. She said, "About this, you coming over." I said I was aware. She looked at me. She had that look sometimes, direct and a little hard, that I'd come to understand wasn't unfriendliness but a kind of honesty, like she was checking to see if you meant what you said. She said, "Does that bother you?" I thought about it, said, "Does it bother you?" She was quiet for a moment, said, "I've found that people in small towns talk about what they don't understand. I've stopped expecting them to stop." I said that seemed right. She said, "What I mean is, it won't stop. If you keep coming, it won't stop and it'll get louder." I said I knew that. She said, "I'm 47 years old." I said I knew that too. She looked at me a moment longer and then she got up and poured more coffee into both our cups and sat back down, and that was all she said about it that day. But something had shifted. The way a weight shifts when two people pick it up together. You both feel it move. Spring came, we built her barn. I organized 4 men from across the county, not charity. I paid them out of what I had, and she argued with me about it for 2 days before she allowed it, and we put up a sound barn in 9 days. I drove posts and raised rafters, and when it was done, I was prouder of it than I was of anything I'd built on my own ground. I don't know entirely why. Because she'd needed it, maybe. Because she stood at the edge of the site every day and watched with those eyes that didn't miss anything. And on the last day when the doors were hung, she put her hand on the frame and ran it along the wood, checking the fit, and she said, "That's a good barn." That was it, that's a good barn. But she said it to me, looking at me, and coming from her it was something. By summer, we weren't pretending anymore that my visits were about anything practical. I'd come on evenings when there was no particular reason to come. We'd sit on her porch and she'd read and I'd whittle, which is a habit I'd picked up from my father and never lost, or we'd just talk. She told me about Denver. She'd been married. Her husband had died 6 years ago, a sickness, quick, and she'd handled everything after because there was no one else, and she'd found, handling it, that she was more capable than she'd been led to believe. She'd sold the house in Denver, kept enough to start over. The rest had gone to debts, and the funeral and a year of being very quiet and figuring out what she wanted. What she'd wanted was land, something real under her, something that wasn't going to go anywhere. I said I understood that. She said, "I thought you might." I told her about my father, the way he'd been careful all his life and then sick and then gone, and how the land he'd worked his whole life had been somebody else's land, and that I'd decided, not when he died but after, once the quiet settled in, that I wasn't going to work for 30 years and have nothing to show for it, that I was going to have ground with my name on the paper. She was quiet for a while, then she said, "You know what Ed Marker told me about you, the first day?" I said I could guess. She said, "He said you were young and stubborn and probably in over your head, and that it was a shame because you seemed like a decent enough kid, but that ground was going to break you inside of 5 years." I said that was about what I'd expected him to say. She said, "I thought, well, we'll see about that." I looked at her. She was looking at the dark past the porch rail, at the pasture where her sheep were moving around in the last of the evening light, pale shapes in the dusk. She said it like a thing she'd been thinking for a while and decided to say out loud, matter of fact, like she was reporting a fact. I said, "And?" She said, "And you built that barn better than most men twice your age would have." I didn't say anything. The thing was settling in my chest like something warm you've been handed on a cold day. I wasn't going to make more of it than she'd offered. But she wasn't done. She said, "You came the night of the fire without being asked. You came back the next morning. You fought me about the labor, and you were right to, and I knew you were right, and I kept arguing anyway because I don't like owing." She paused, said, "I'm telling you I know the difference between a man doing something because he feels sorry for you and a man doing something because it matters to him." I said it mattered. She said, "I know." We sat there, the sheep moved in the pasture. A coyote called somewhere east and one of the dogs answered it, and then it went quiet again. She said, "This is complicated." I said, I know it is. She said, my first husband was 8 years older than me, and the whole town thought that was strange too. I spent the first 2 years ignoring what people said about it. I said, did it get easier? She said, the second year. When they saw it was real. Another long quiet. I'd gotten used to her silences. They weren't empty, they were full, she was thinking, and when she was done thinking she'd say what she'd thought, and interrupting the process was something I'd learned not to do. She said, I'm not going to tell you I'm not afraid of this. I said, I wouldn't believe you if you did. She said, but I'm less afraid of this than I am of spending the next 20 years alone on this land with nothing but sheep and books for company. She paused, which I realize is not the most romantic thing anyone's ever said. I said it sounded honest to me. She looked at me then, and in the last of the evening light her face there was something in it I hadn't seen before or hadn't recognized. Softer than usual. Still her, still that directness, but the armor down enough that I could see what was underneath it. And what was underneath it was a woman who had been doing everything alone for a long time and was very tired of it, and who had decided, against her habits of caution, to say so. I reached over and I took her hand. She let me. Her hand was strong, were cruffined. She didn't look at me when I took it, she looked at the pasture, but she turned it over and held mine back. That was how it started. Or not started, it had been going on since February, maybe before that, since she'd looked at me in the street. But that was the night we said so. I won't pretend the next few months were simple. They weren't. Creston being Creston, everyone had something to say, and they said it. And some of it was said to my face, which I preferred to having it said behind my back, and some wasn't. Ed Marker told 2 or 3 men at the hardware that it wasn't natural and that I must be after her land, which I heard about and didn't dignify with a response, which was harder than it sounds. Cletus Osgood sent me a note, which is the only time in 2 years he'd communicated with me at all. That said in about 30 words that he'd always thought I was an idiot, and now he had proof. A man named Greer, who fancied himself a sort of informal voice of the county, pulled me aside after Sunday services. The one Sunday I went to Sunday services, which was out of a kind of social obligation and not much else, and said he hoped I'd thought carefully about what I was doing and considered the woman's reputation, by which he meant his opinion of it, not hers. I thanked him and walked away. I'm still proud of that. Thanked him and walked away. I didn't say what I was thinking, which took restraint, but there are times a man is better served by quiet than by being right. Nora's reception was harder. A woman alone can always move through a town more or less unmolested as long as she's widowed and respectable and keeps her business to herself. Once she isn't keeping her business to herself, once she's attached to something, especially something people think is unusual, then she becomes a subject. Women she'd begun to know a little stopped nodding as warmly in the street. The wife of the man who sold her seed oats made a comment in the feed store that Nora told me about weeks later, matter-of-factly, the way she told me most things, and which still makes me clench my jaw when I think about it. Something about what a woman of her age ought to have learned by now about keeping her dignity. I asked her if it bothered her. She said, Mrs. Partridge has been saying things like that about various women in this county since before you were born, and she'll be saying them about other women long after we're both gone. I don't have time to be troubled by Mrs. Partridge. I said I wished I could be as easy about it as she was. She said, I'm not easy about it, I just don't let it show. She said that quietly, without drama, and I understood hearing it that it cost her something the same way it cost me something, and that she was paying that cost deliberately because she decided it was worth it. That was the thing about her. Everything she did was decided. She didn't drift into things or out of them. She chose. The fall came. October, my 3rd fall on that ground, and the cattle I'd taken to market brought more than I'd hoped, enough to clear a piece of the Laramie loan and have a little left. And when I came back from Laramie, I went straight to her place before I went to my own. She was at the kitchen table with the account book she kept for the sheep operation, which was doing better than even she'd expected. She had a feel for those animals, for what the market wanted, and she'd been rotating them into different pastures in a pattern she'd worked out herself that kept the grass from going sour. I told her the number. She looked at me, said, that's a good number. I said it was, said it meant I could see my way to the thing being viable. Not thriving, not yet, but viable. She closed the account book. She said, I've been thinking. I said, I imagine you have. She said, I was thinking that two pieces of land side by side, run well, could do better than either one alone. I looked at her. She was looking at the account book. She said, I was also thinking that I have more books than one person needs, and that you have more fence line than one person can manage. I said, Nora. She said, and I was thinking that Ed Marker is going to have something to say about it no matter what, so we might as well give him something worth saying. I said, is that a proposal? She looked up at me then, that look, direct and a little bit daring, and underneath it something warm and sure. She said, I suppose it is, unless you have a better reason to say no. I said, I don't have a single reason to say no. She nodded, opened the account book again, said, then we should think about the logistics. I started laughing. I couldn't help it. She looked up at me, startled, and then the corner of her mouth went and she was laughing too, which I hadn't heard before, really laughing, full and unguarded. And it changed her face in a way that made me feel like I'd been given something, like I'd been let into a room other people didn't get to see. We were married in November, the same week the previous year the buckboard wheel had given out. The preacher who married us was a man named Holt who'd come out from Cheyenne, my sister's suggestion, which meant he didn't know any of the stories, and so he married us without any drama at all. And afterward we had a meal at Mee's with my sister and her husband Warren and two of the men who'd helped build the barn, and it was quiet. Exactly what we wanted. Ed Marker said some things. Cletus Osgood said some things. Mrs. Partridge said things I was grateful I didn't hear directly. And then over the next year people mostly stopped saying things. Not because we'd won them over necessarily or because their opinions had changed. Just because we were still there. The Prout place and the Alcott place, though people started calling it Prout-Alcott before long and then just Prout after a while because that's how a county keeps its records. The cattle and the sheep on the same range, which took some learning and some patience but which she'd been right about. The land didn't mind. And the rotation she'd worked out with the sheep actually improved the grass that the cattle moved onto in the fall, which I hadn't expected and which she had because she'd read about it in one of her books. We built a room onto the house that winter. Her books needed space, and so did her equipment she'd taken to keeping notes on everything, temperatures and rainfall and grass height and sheep weights, all of it in notebooks that accumulated on the shelf beside the books. I built the shelves myself. She didn't ask me to. I just did it one afternoon when she was out checking the ewes, and when she came back and saw them, she ran her hand along the wood the way she'd run her hand along the barn door frame. She said, "These are good shelves." I said, "I thought you needed them." She turned and looked at me, and she had a look sometimes, not often, that was different from her usual, softer, not the directness but something underneath it, something that wasn't about thinking or working out a problem, that was just feeling something. She had that look. She crossed the room and put her hand against my face, just her palm against my jaw, and she said, "You're the most quietly useful man I've ever known." Quietly useful. I've thought about that 1,000 times since she said it. Quietly useful isn't what a young man imagines he wants to be. When you're young, you want to be remarkable, or at least not invisible. But she didn't mean it small. Coming from her, quietly useful meant you see what needs doing and you do it without making it about yourself. It meant you're the kind of person I want next to me. It meant I see you exactly who you are, and that's what I chose. Her hand was still on my jaw. I put mine over it. I don't need to tell you everything that followed, the years that came. Good ones and the bad, a drought in '87 that cost us more than I want to say, and the blizzard of '89 that took 23 head and 2 of her best ewes and kept us snowed in for 11 days, during which we played cards and read and talked more than we'd talked in a month of ordinary days. And one of those evenings she told me things about her first marriage she'd never told anyone, and I told her about the night I'd sat in the snow next to those 2 dead cattle and almost given up. The thing I'd never told another person, and she listened the way she always listened, still, eyes somewhere else, taking it in, and then she said, "I'm glad you didn't." Just that, I'm glad you didn't, but the way she said it. I'm glad you didn't was the same as saying, I'm glad you were here when I stepped off that stage. I'm glad you were the one who came across the street. I'm glad you came the night of the fire and came back the next morning and kept coming. I'm glad we did this. That's what she meant. I knew it, and she knew I knew it. 43 head of cattle and a flock of sheep, the fall I married her. By the 5th year, it was over 300 cattle, and she doubled the flock. By the 10th year, people in the county weren't talking about the odd Prout marriage anymore. They were asking Nora Alcott Prout about her rotation system, asking me about my fencing setup, and two young men from a spread near Laramie came out one spring to look at how we'd run the mixed operation because they'd heard it was working, which it was. Ed Marker died in 1891. I don't take pleasure in that. He was a man who needed to have opinions about other people's lives to feel good about his own, and that's a sadder thing to be than a villainous one. But I won't pretend I didn't feel something when I heard it. Cletus Osgood came over one afternoon in the summer of 1892. Just showed up. I was in the yard and he came up the road and got down off his horse and looked around with his usual cross expression and said, "Heard you were doing all right." I said we were. He said, "Wife around?" I called for Nora. She came out and said good afternoon and offered coffee. He said he'd take it. We sat on the porch for about an hour. He and Nora talked mostly. She had a way with difficult people, which I'd noticed before, a patience that wasn't soft but that could wait out almost anything. By the end of the hour, Cletus Osgood was telling her about the trouble he'd been having with his south pasture drainage, and she was telling him what she'd done with a similar situation on the East Quarter, and he was listening with something that on anyone else I'd have called respect. He left at evening and said it had been a good visit. He came back twice more before he died, which was the following spring. I went to his funeral, 3 people there including me. What I'm trying to say, I've been going a long time, and I'm not always good at knowing when I've made the point, is that the best thing that ever happened to me came off a stage in December of 1883 with a folded piece of paper in her coat pocket, and the good sense to not care what Ed Marker thought about anything. I was 26 years old and a quarter-mile from failure, and I didn't know it yet, or maybe I did and wasn't letting myself look at it straight. And she came. Not because of me, not at first. She came because she wanted land, and she got it, and I happened to be nearby when her barn burned. That's how real things start. Not in a flash, not in a story. In proximity and small tests and the accumulation of days that add up to this. She's at the table right now. I can see her from the window where I'm standing, the late afternoon light coming in across her shoulder, her head bent over one of the notebooks. The gray in her hair is all through it now, and there are more lines in her face than when she stepped off that stage, and she holds the pen a little differently than she used to because her left hand gives her trouble in the cold. She looks up sometimes and writes something and looks back down. I've watched her work like that for going on 14 years, and I can't say it without sounding foolish, so I won't say it, but I still watch. People will tell you that a young man and an older woman is a thing that starts a certain way and ends a certain way, and there's a kind of knowing in how they say it, like they've seen this particular thing before and they know where it goes. They haven't seen this particular thing. Nobody has, because it's ours. She chose me. That's what I keep coming back to. She didn't need to. She had her land and her sheep and her books, and she'd managed alone longer than I'd been alive, probably, and she could have gone on managing. But she looked at what I was, not what I might become, not what I used to be, just what I was in that particular moment, mid-20s and stubborn and barely keeping the thing together, and she decided it was worth it. That's the miracle, not a word I use. But that's what it was. You can call me a fool for marrying a woman 20 years my elder with opinions stronger than any man I've ever known, and a way of running an account book that makes me feel like I'm still learning arithmetic. I've been called worse for less reason. But I'll tell you this. I have never once, not in 14 years of mornings and hard winters and a drought and a blizzard and all the rest, I have never once wished it was different. Quietly useful, that's what she said. She looked at me with those brown eyes in that kitchen with her hand on my jaw, and she told me what she saw. And the thing is, the reason I'm still standing in this window watching her work is that I believed her.